So first of all, let me thank the organizers of this conference for giving me this opportunity to talk about my current research. It is a great privilege to open up the discussion about Eastern and Central European artistic presence in Western metropolises. At least that's the way I understood the subject of the title, the topic of the conference. And I will start with a case study of Paris, whose intense artistic life in the interwar period was in great part due to the active contribution of foreigners, as you all know. If the art historians are quite well informed about Montparnasse literary and visual art scenes of this period, the contribution of the same artistic circles to high fashion is less frequently discussed. In comparison to the history of art, the fashion history remains a richer source of information about the decorative works of artists whose names are normally associated to more noble forms of artistic expression as painting, sculpture, or architecture. The rare fashion houses of the 1920s and 30s that subsist until today, like Elsa Schiaparelli, are willingly putting forward those artistic collaborations in their attempt to make fashion gain legitimacy of an art practice. To give you an example, Elsa Schiaparelli, Italian-born fashion designer active in Paris between 1927 and 1940, whose work is often associated with the Surrealist movement, commissioned different types of works to the avant-garde artists. On the cover of this catalogue, entirely devoted to her artistic collaborations, you can see some big names like that of the prominent designer Jean-Michel Franck, who conceived the interior design of her boutique, Christian Bérard, who was a costume designer and fashion illustrator, Jean Cocteau, who drew ornaments for Schiaparelli's clothes, like this one, for example. Alberto Giacometti designed jewelry for her. And leaving aside the prestige of these collaborations, the shift between fashion design and the medium in which the artist normally works can itself be seen as a source of creativity. In some way, it's maybe the non-professional character of the contribution made by an outsider that gives so much value to those hybrid fashion objects. Considering the economic importance of Parisian fashion industry in the interwar period made me wonder if any émigré artist played any role in its development. In a fragile social and economic situation that an artist in exile have lived, working for fashion could have been a temporary solution to his economic difficulties. Several mentions in the artists' biographies of their contributions to fashion were enough for me to suppose that this temporary reconversion could have been a fairly widespread practice on the Parisian art scene of the 1920s, especially among women. So I started to search for a network of costume jewelry designers because that were the objects I was basically interested in. But the lack of archives and material objects that subsist until today didn't allow me to reconstruct this strictly professional circle. But what I discovered instead was even more interesting. It was an intellectual and artistic circle that was much more diverse in the professional way, social origins, and political positioning of its members. Besides decorative artists, this network included writers, left-wing journalists, publishers, and photographers. In what will follow, I will try to unfold this network, starting with the careers of these three émigré women who, at some point of their careers, worked for Parisian fashion. What unites them besides making, designing, or consuming costume jewelry are the exile and their origins. All of them are coming from the former Russian Empire. They immigrated almost at the same period, at least after October Revolution, and invested Parisian art scene in the 1920s. I have consciously chosen women who were also well connected with the Parisian literature scene, because I was curious about how they would inscribe their fashion experience that consisted in manual work and elaborating appearances into their intellectual production. I would like to justify the prominence of literary sources, firstly, by the richness of the written documentation that these women provide because they wrote a lot, and secondly, those who are interested in Eastern European artistic scene in exile know that they shouldn't underestimate the significance of literature that was a field of political and cultural battle between the old and the new. As far as decorative art is concerned, particularly fashion, the economic interest of the activities it reunites makes out of it a space where new class roles were distributed among Eastern Europeans in exile. Many of them, coming from intellectual Moscow and St. Petersburg circles, found themselves in the situation where they had to turn to handwork that would respond to the commission of local aristocracy and high bourgeoisie, who were the main clients of high fashion houses. And my last preliminary remark will concern the fact that all the three artists I chose were women, as you can see. You may have already guessed that the couples that they formed with some prominent avant-garde artists played a significant role in their negotiations of a place on the local art scene. So this research still in progress. I would be very glad for any remark or knowledge about the other cases of women in decorative art that you would like to share with me. I would like to start with a quote of Nina Berberova, a Russian-speaking émigré writer that some of you may have heard of. Having left Soviet Russia in 1922 with her companion, poet Vladislav Khodasevich, she came to Paris in 1925. The following passage comes from her memoirs, Italics Are Mine, that's the title of the memoirs, that came out for the first time in English translation in 1969. What will particularly interest us will be the first two sentences of this passage. I strung beads, she writes. Many of us did. Putting a string through beads could mean two different things, producing costume jewelry or ornamenting clothes. And to define very briefly costume jewelry, it is a non-precious body adornment that doesn't necessarily imitate gems or costly metals as in 18th or 19th centuries. And since its value doesn't lie in the precious materials, the aesthetic effect of the costume jewelry and its formal diversity opens a range of endless possibilities of combination with a certain look, piece of clothes, or an accessory. Berberova is not very specific about when she was making these adornments and for whom, private clients or fashion houses. This could mean that the experience in itself was not the one she would love to commemorate, taking into consideration the fact that she was already a well-established writer when she was publishing those words. From the comparisons that follow in this passage, with other poorly paid jobs like cross-stitching, inscribing cards, or being extra in films, adorning is presented as a mechanical, repetitive gesture that Berberova doesn't seem to consider as an artistic practice, but rather a work. Considering a certain fictional dimension of memoirs, we can't be sure whether this description fits Berberova's lived experience, but we can affirm at least that it describes quite accurately the reality of women workers employed by high-fashion Parisian houses of that period, many of whom were women from Eastern Europe in exile or long-term immigration. So, who does Berberova point at by saying us in the second sentence? Given the fact that reflecting about the experience of exile constitutes one of the main topics of her literary work, she's most definitely speaking about émigrés like herself, and most probably women. The immigration from the Russian Empire provided to the after-war Paris a significant workforce that was important in the context of lack of men. Seamstresses founding their own workshops or working as private servants at bourgeois houses, workers at fashion houses, were considered both by French and by Russian immigration present in Paris at that time as an archetype of a Russian immigrant in the interwar Paris, a kind of female counterpart of a taxi driver. But, yeah, that's true. Berberova herself exploits this archetype in her fiction. In one theater piece that she titled Madame, this theater piece was staged in Paris in the so-called Russian theater in 1938. Berberova relates a story of an exilé woman who works as a seamstress, receiving her clients and working at home. The main character finds herself trapped in the life she didn't choose, but continues to bear it alongside with two men with whom she lives, her husband and her lover, with both of whom she lives at the same time in this apartment where she works, and both of them work as taxi drivers, one by night and the other one by day. So in this theater piece, the poorly paid work and drastic living conditions of immigrants bring a tragic social and moral fall of Russians in exile who were militaries or high bourgeoisie in their past lives. Historians stress the fact that sewing was the non-qualified job that was the most accessible to women in exile. Because, and I quote, what well-educated woman couldn't sew at that time? However, from the way Berberova describes herself stringing beads and making embroidery, suggests us that she had neither the creative flair nor the craftsmanship expertise, and maybe because she was an intellectual. But that was not the only type of work that the fashion industry reserved for immigrant women. Employing women aristocrats as models was a current practice of that time. I'm showing you this other picture that I already showed with a bracelet and the shoes because it's the same woman whose name is Nathalie Palais. Many French but also Russian aristocrats became well-known models exhibiting clothes with what the clients of fashion houses perceived as the natural-born grace. Here is the Princess Nathalie Palais, who was a descendant of the Romanovs family and was a quite successful model of the 20s in Paris. This demand was additionally fueled by Slavic Orientalism that invaded Paris fashion since the success of the Diaghilev ballets, and some Russian immigrants exploited this Orientalism, playing with the name of their fashion house, folkloric motifs, and brand image, like the house of KEMKI that produced embroidery for Chanel, for example. And here you see a very recent study about this house, or the fashion house called Marie Nowitzki. As you can already see, the integration of Russian exilés in Paris into Parisian haute couture took place on very different levels, depending on their financial, cultural, and social capital at the moment of their arrival in France. It goes without saying that the little jobs that Berberova accomplished at home, paid under the table, like some of the characters of her prose, had nothing to do with the glamour of Orientalist haute couture. However, haute couture created a context in which former aristocrats and those who supported the bourgeois revolution, or those again who were not opposed to Soviet rule and were still reluctant to come back to Soviet Russia, could meet. Not only could they meet, but they also worked together. And that's why I showed you the photo of Nathalie Palais, because I think that the bracelet was made by Elsa Triolet, who we are going to talk about next, because I know that Triolet worked for the couturier Lucien Lelon, and that they were even friends, and that Nathalie Palais was his companion for a while. So I asked myself, what did it mean to adorn in exile the bodies of those who were their political enemies in the homeland? The only other woman jewelry designer that Berberova mentions in her text is Elsa Triolet, also an Émigré writer. Her work for high fashion was a little bit known at the moment when Berberova memoirs were coming out, and this knowledge must be due to the jewelry as the poetic motif in the love poetry of Louis Aragon. Louis Aragon was the husband of Elsa Triolet, and him you may know, I guess. It's after the war that Triolet becomes known as a writer and especially as an agent of French-Soviet cultural exchange supervised by the French Communist Party. At one point, Triolet felt the need to justify the link between her work for haute couture with the commitment to communism, which she develops alongside Aragon at the same period that she makes costume jewelry, in the beginning of the 1930s. The jewelry appears in her literature as a motif in several novels of Triolet, as well as in her journalistic writings. But her attitude towards high fashion stays basically as distanced as that of Berberova. Justified by the financial need, jewelry making doesn't seem to have any artistic value for Triolet, even though her contribution to the high fashion adornment was quite significant. Actually, she lived for 3 years with the money earned exclusively from jewelry making and worked for the best fashion designers of that time. In 1932, in Moscow, Triolet attempts to publish a story that she claims to be documentary and names it Necklaces. In this text, she describes the reality of the working class exploited by the Parisian haute couture houses that she saw with her own eyes. The story ends up with this quote and farewell forever to Parisian haute couture. She says that she hopes never to come back to jewelry making again as a way to gain money as a writer. And by doing that, Triolet attempts to join the movement of Soviet proletarian literature, meant to be produced and read by new dominant class. This pro-Soviet orientation of Triolet in literature and in politics was the reason why Berberova and Triolet didn't get along. Indeed, the two women belonged to different Russian literature circles whose repartition in exile followed political reasons. Even without associating herself with the white immigration, Berberova was much more involved with the cultural and intellectual life of the Russian immigration, publishing her writings in immigration journals. And as far as Triolet is concerned, she published her novels in Russian language in Moscow during the 1920s and was very much supported in her beginnings by Viktor Shklovsky and Maxim Gorky. Triolet hesitated to go back to Soviet Russia and traveled there with Aragon from the beginning of the 1930s, as well as cultivated personal relationships with the Soviet art and cultural scene, especially through her sister Lili Brick, who lived in Moscow. However, as far as the costume jewelry production is concerned, Berberova identifies herself with Triolet. The manual decorative work that was a sign of social downgrading both for Berberova and Triolet was reflected differently in their writings. If for Nina Berberova, the manual badly paid work was a devastating experience that provoked moral fall of Russians in exile, Elsa Triolet exploits the proximity offered by her work for fashion to the working class in order to express her political critique. After failing to publish the story that I just presented in its integrity in Soviet Russia, Triolet partially recycles it in a shorter essay about women working for high fashion houses in a communist journal Regard, where Triolet was responsible for fashion section in 1936 and 1938. And interestingly enough, among all the articles that she published, this was the only one that was published under her real name and not a pseudonym. And the article is devoted to the workshops of haute couture houses in Paris and is critical of the work conditions of women. And the photos of this article were made by Elizabeth Makowska, our third and last character, whom we can finally meet to the end of my presentation. We know very little about Makowska, whom you see photographed by Elie Lotard. We know that she was a painter in the photograph and was close to the Association of Revolutionary Artists and Writers that was founded in Paris in 1932, and that through her personal relationships. She was married to the writer Vladimir Posner and later photographer Elie Lotard, who were part of this association. Louis Aragon was also part of it. Makowska was also a friend and a client of Elsa Triolet. On this photo, she is sitting adorned with one of her necklaces. The range of personal clients of Triolet was quite diverse, including women who worked in fashion houses like models or selling personnel. And being worn by Parisian high bourgeoisie, artistic bohemia, and employees of fashion houses at the same time, the costume jewelry seems to abolish for a short while any distinctions among its consumers, or at least among their appearances. And my last point would be to put this type of journalistic report of Triolet and Makowska in a larger context. And I would like to give one example of this article for the magazine Vue. It is devoted to the production of costume jewelry and lingerie adornment in Parisian workshops. And actually this article, that is a critique of work condition of women workers, is a great source of information for fashion history, because by criticizing the work conditions, it describes very well in every little detail the process of production of adornment. And I wanted to use this publication to close up the loop between French communist movement and the high fashion, and to show that fashion production can be studied together with the political commitment of their makers. And this connection can go beyond a personal contradiction, like in Elsa Triolet's case, who felt that he had to justify herself in front of your Soviet audience for her work for fashion. So I would like to draw your attention at the fact that this journal was created and directed by Lucien Vogel. He was married to Cosette Vogel, who is next to him, and she was the first editor-in-chief of Vogue. And she was also the sister of Michel de Brunoff, the next editor-in-chief of French Vogue. And that's him who brought Elsa Triolet to fashion. That's what she writes in her book. So I guess I don't have any more time. Okay, thank you. Thank you.